Okay, so welcome. We've come to chapters 41 to 50 of Revelations of Divine Love. They're really interesting chapters, but I say that every time, don't I? So I'm kind of repeating myself once again, but I think they're really interesting. And in our introduction today, I want to give us a little bit of background information and sort of what scholars kind of understand about Julian and who she was and what she may have been doing with her time as an anchoress. But first of all, before we look at that, just to give you a bit of an overview of how these chapters kind of hang together. So primarily, they're about prayer. They're about prayer, but they sort of extend out to how do we relate to God? What is our relationship with God? How do we understand our relationship with God? And what exactly is it that mars that relationship? So in a sense, what Julian's doing is she's kind of taking us behind the veil of how things really are between ourselves and God, rather than how we actually experience it. So we're looking at actually how God relates to us and how there's something quite inherent within us that actually enables us to relate to God. And I suppose that all comes from that Genesis, we are made in the image and likeness of God. But she really goes very deeply into that and thinks, well, what does that exactly mean? And what does it mean then for our prayer lives? And she ends with this really interesting understanding that there is a higher and then there is a lower judgment. And the higher is how God sees us, and it is the spiritual, but it's often hidden, and how we relate to the world, which is the lower judgment, and it's the kind of mess and all that kind of stuff that we have to live in. And she's trying to help us to realize that all the lower judgment, that Holy Church and all that, and all the ways in which we quite hard on ourselves about sin and how we sort of mess up and we feel often very separated from God, how that judgment is not the final is not the final say on actually how things really are, that there is this higher judgment in which sometimes we can have a sight into, but mainly it is through faith that we trust in. But today I want to really give you a little bit of background into what really is sort of initiating this discussion that she has on prayer, because it's very much right at the beginning on chapter 41. We get this idea that what Julian is bringing to the table is not something that she's just been musing about, but actually that it's a pastoral problem that she understands other people to have. And she begins right at the beginning of this 14th revelation with this sense that there is this concern that when people pray, that there is this real dryness in their prayers. I wonder if that's a familiar kind of adjective for you that you may have used in the past. And also this kind of inherent sense that I wonder if God actually hears what I'm praying about. So we're very much in the realm of petitionary prayer, intercessory prayer. We're not in the realm of mystical prayer. We're not in that, or contemplative prayer. We're not in the realm of silent contemplation. We're in the realm of, dear God, please help those poor people across the world who are suffering. And we all pray that every day. We all hold up our prayers. And then a sense in well, nothing seems to be happening. So do we even trust that God has heard us in our prayers? So she's right there with this kind of what the medieval people would have called the lowest form of prayer. So they would rank prayers, from the lowest, which is petitionary, to meditation, to contemplation, to mystical, and sort of you would climb up the ladder, I guess. Or you would see them in different modes within your prayer life. Maybe that's a much more helpful way of looking at it than a hierarchical, rising up the ladder. That these are different modes of life, but basically this is the simplest form, dear God, please help. And she says right at the beginning of chapter 41, she keeps using this word our prayers, our concern, our not believing, and so this our is the first person plural possessive determinator. Those of you who've done your grammar learning will know what that means, but for the rest of us who couldn't stand grammar, let alone remember it, basically what that means is that you're talking about yourself, but you're also including into that other people. And she makes that quite clear at the end of the last paragraph, that she is including herself very much in this. So she has had doubts about whether her prayers are heard. And she has experienced this kind of dryness in prayer. So it's not just a generalized statement that she's making. Now, the interesting thing here is, does it point to some kind of experience of other people talking to her about prayer, their prayer lives? Well, a lot of scholars have said, yes, it does. From this, we can begin to sort of piece together. This is one of the little bits of knowledge that that are given to us, that we can start to piece together what may be the life of Julian. What was it like for her to be an anchoress? Now, if we think of an anchoress, the person who is incarcerated into a room on the side of a church, we get that sense that the anchoress is actually being, put in a room, put aside, dedicated to God, out of sight, someone else in this whole wonderful world of prayer, and they're just praying for people and helping them through the day. Well, that's one way of understanding an anchoress, but another way is understanding just how much she was a central part of the community. Because the Anchor in Louisa tells us, and we have, ruins to point to archaeological evidence, that an anchoress would have had two windows. One window that pointed into the church so that they could see the Mass and the services and partake in them. But also there was another window that looked out onto the world, and this would have had some kind of curtain across it. Now, the Anchor in Louisa tells us, warns the anchoress to not be tempted to spend too much time at that worldly window, not to be into the state of holy gossip, however holy that might seem, but actually to not be tempted to just sit there and listen to people. So we get this notion that actually this second window is not just so she can look out on the world or chat to her neighbours, that it's actually fulfilling a really vital role within the community, that people would have come to her for spiritual advice. And that's really, really interesting when you then start to think, okay, so Julian of Norwich, she's in that little church of St. Julian. She's right on a main road coming from Yarmouth up into Norwich. It would have been a really busy road if you think the link with the Low Countries would have been quite profound. That's where they really linked to, rather than to London. That's also where they got all their ideas and their commerce and their trade. So she's on this road right into the heart of Norwich. So people traveling past her would have known that there was an anchoress there and would have come to her with their own spiritual concerns. Now, it may be something as simple as, my husband's gone to sea, I'm really concerned about him. Will you pray for him? Or it may have been something like, I have dryness in prayer. I can't pray anymore. The Mass is dead to me. What do I do? How do I understand? So this just tiny little paragraph gives us a real insight into Julian, the spiritual director. And we don't often think about Julian as being someone who's a spiritual director, but actually, the more we begin to understand about her in these terms, the more the text begins to open up to us that actually what she's talking about are the pastoral spiritual issues that are actually brought to her window. Now, what's really interesting is I can say all this and you go, oh, Emma, I'm not too sure about that. You're kind of making a lot out of a very few words. But actually, we've got a little bit more evidence that can back up the text. The first one is that right at the beginning of the short text, a scribe has added in as a kind of a preface that it was written. This preface is written in 1413, and it says that this is written by Julian of Norwich, who is very devout and well known and is still alive. So immediately we got this understanding that Julian was not incarcerated and shut away and not known, that actually she was a kind of celebrity of the church at that time, and that people would go and see her. And I'm noticing in the chat that Marjorie Kemp went to see her. Fantastic. You know your Julian, which is brilliant. So of course, yes, the other bit of evidence is that we have Marjorie Kemp actually documenting that she went to see Julian of Norwich. And I think the year of that, again, was around 1413. Now, those of you who know Marjorie Kemp, and those of you who don't know Marjorie Kemp, she was somebody who lived around the time of Julian. She came from Kingsley, which would have been just up the road from Norwich. And she lived what was known as a quite extraordinary life. And I'm delighted to say that once we finish Julian Norwich, that in September we'll be starting to read Marjorie of Kemp. She's a great read, and she's very different from Julian. But she had similar kind of revelations, but they're they're more like visions than revelations. And we'll talk about that when we come to Marjorie Kemp. But Marjorie, throughout her life and throughout her book, she's kind of dogged with this sense of self-doubt. And it comes out of different episodes that we'll look at. But she's also, she keeps going to different people. She keeps trying to get help from them. And it comes to a sort of a head. And what a priest says to her, what you really need to do is need to go and see Julian. And the priest describes her as an anchoress who was expert in such things and could give good counsel. So even if we just take that little phrase, then we know that Julian must have been known for the spiritual advice that she gave from her window. But Marjorie Kemp gives us a little bit more than that, which is really great, because we actually get a little window into what their conversation might have been like. Now, this is gold dust, really, to people like me who study Julian, because we begin to hear the voice of Julian, even though it's secondhand. But also we get a little window into that wonderful forum of spiritual direction. Those of you who give spiritual direction or receive it will know often it's a very, very sacred space where conversation is held within the presence of Christ. And it's not always something that is documented. It's often held as a kind of just beyond a kind of confession, but it's a kind of safe space where people can reflect. So it's kind of unusual to get a real insight. So we get this account of Marjorie's vision, Marjorie's visit to Julian. Now, there's no mention of a text. Julian doesn't sort of get out a book and say, well, actually, if you read chapter, 41 to 40 to 50, you'll get a really good idea. She doesn't do that. So we don't have a notion that the book was written or completed or in publication or in circulation. We have nothing about the text. But instead, we do get an understanding of what Julian may have said, what Julian says to her. And right from the beginning, it's clear that Marjorie wants some verification, some justification, some understanding about these visions she's having. Now, Julian then, first of all, counsels her to be obedient to the will of God and to fulfill whatever he places in her soul, as long as it is to the worship of God and profitable to mine even Christian. And there we are, mine even Christian. And we know that keeps popping up in the text, and it's there. So we can hear, oh my goodness, I bet that's exactly the kind of thing she would have said. And she goes on to say, so don't do, it's something that, so anything that goes against this is not of a good spirit, it's of an evil spirit. So what she's telling Marjorie, she's giving her the tools of discernment. So whatever you feel that you've been given, if it follows the good wisdom and the counsel of the Holy Spirit and follows the teaching of Holy Church and is valuable to mine even Christian, then that it comes from the Holy Spirit. But if it doesn't, goes against that, then it's of an evil spirit. And then she tells us that only the Holy Spirit can make the soul steadfast in righteousness and in right faith. If it's not of the Holy Spirit, then the soul is like the sea. It's unstable and unsteadfast. And we're going to see that in the later chapters, a kind of parallel that, how the soul, how the person gets sort of shaken and knocked around and, can't decide one way or another. And really she doesn't in the revelations of divine love describe it as in sea, but we do get that also that sense of being blinded, being distorted, not understanding, being, all those things which actually would relate to this understanding of being tossed around like a sea. So the Holy Spirit can only make the soul steadfast in right faith. If it's not, then the soul is like the sea, as I've said. So Marjorie's given those tools to discern. And then what's really interesting is that Julian alludes to Romans 8:26. And those words, that verse is, we do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Now, if we hear those words and we think about what the rest of these chapters are going on to say, literally, they are an unpacking of those very words, how it is not we who pray, but it is the Spirit who prays through us. So Julian puts this in terms of the ground of our beseeching. Christ is the ground of our beseeching. And utterly there, we see those words of Romans being made accessible, being made relevant to actually her audience. So she's saying, look, when you pray intercessory prayer, it's not actually you who's saying, please help the world, please bring peace to the world. It is actually the desire, the groaning, the need of God that is overflowing through you. And it's just Romans. And we see that in that visit to Marjorie, and we're going to see it absolutely in our chapters tonight. And then she sort of ends with follow two virtues, and these are very specific virtues for Marjorie. It's a kind of, this is what you need to hear, Marjorie. First of all, just keep the perseverance. And of course, Marjorie must have really told her how difficult her life has been, how many obstacles people have put in place, how many people have said, oh, you're just you're just a little bit crazy, Marjorie. And so Julian says, don't give up. Don't give up. Persevere in the face of whatever people say to you. So she's really giving her great advice, but she's also saying, well, actually, Marjorie, I believe in you. So that must have been enormously comforting and encouraging for poor old Marjorie Kemp, and exactly probably what she needs to hear. And the other thing is be patient. Be patient. And again, this is going to be something that's going to come out very clearly within the revelations about being patient with ourselves, that we don't know everything now. And we need to be patient within the condition in which we sit, trusting that we will know all things in the end. We will understand this secret thing that God will do. So there we are. This wonderful insight into Julian, the spiritual director. And it's interesting that right at the end of that account, that Julian and that Marjorie Kemp documents that she spent a number of days with Julian. This isn't just an hour greeting or an hour of kind of counsel. They spend time together, they talk together. And I think that shows us something that's very precious about the 14th century. This idea that, it's about people talking together, that truth is found, that wisdom is discerned. And so often in our, in our very busy lives, and we often can't give each other that sort of quality time. And the medieval period is reminding us that it's through that time we give to each other that actually we can build each other up, but also that we can begin to see the marvel of what God is doing in people's lives, and question and doubt, but also listen to how God is working through us and within us. So I think that's also something precious that that this account by Marjorie also gives us. And it's something that we see all the way through Julian's writing, this sense that she's taken time, nearly 20 years just to think and reflect on what she's been given. So I wanted to give you that as a bit of a background for today, because I think it's a good entrance, but also I think it's helpful for the chapters that we'll be coming to later, because particularly when we get to chapters 70, 75, 76, all that we'll be dealing very much with pastoral issues. And I think the next revelation again comes out of a pastoral concern. So it's really good to have in the back of our heads this vision and understanding that Julian's bringing to us, talking into the actual concerns of our day. And once we begin to understand what they are, we think, oh my goodness, well, actually, the concerns of the spiritual life haven't really changed very much. You know, we're still concerned about these things. And Julian gives us this wonderful sort of, I suppose it does very much help us in understanding our own spiritual life and also that of others. So that's my little preamble. As usual, I'm going to try and I'm going to screen share once again, which will have the questions on. Let me see, and then I'll put the questions in the chat as well. Once again, please, please, if you don't want to look at these questions, then look at the ones you wish to. So hopefully, hopefully those are the questions for you. And then what I would do, nope, sorry. I will then copy these. Oopsie. And then I'll put these into the chat. Mm. Mm. I can't do this very well. It happens every time. Okay. Oh, someone asked, do I know how many anchoresses were in Norwich? Yes, there were 29 in there we are. There were 29. Quite a lot really, isn't it? So there we go. I'll put it in the chat. I've sent it. Oh, I hope that you can see that. I'll stop sharing. Has that gone in the chat? Yes, someone said yes. Yes, excellent. Fabulous. Thank you very much. Right, so breakout rooms. Okay. No, they weren't all in one church. They were in lots of different churches. So that's 29 churches in Norwich had an anchoress or an anchorite. I hope that answers the question. So here I'm going to create 4 different rooms, which gives you about 6 people in each. Okay, so I've given you the breakout rooms, so you can go and have a chat, and we'll be back at about 5 to 9.